So I'm just checking to make sure that clock is right. It reminds me of a favorite story of mine about clocks. A New York City taxi cab driver got tired of his fares constantly asking him what time it is. So one day it dawns on him to install a clock in the back in the passenger compartment, which he does. So he picks up his first fare that day, and the first thing that the passenger says is that clock right? It started in a few more minutes.
Yeah, you were busy. Well, you know, it's keeping on the bell when you were so many. Well, they were beautiful, but actually.
I think we could probably get started. I'd like to begin with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for another beautiful and wonderful day and the many blessings that you continue to shower upon your people. We thank you for our time ahead, and we thank you for being here in this time and place. We pray your guidance and presence upon us as we learn about grief and loss, something that's near and dear to all of us. Bless, dwell, and abide with us as you always do, and give us the peace that passes all understanding. Through Christ we pray. Amen. I have before you, first of all, a handout so that you have a little overview of the course, where we'll be going. I don't know that I need to read this, but I'll try to maybe just summarize it as you look at it. A society that is in almost complete denial about loss and grief. Why do we have losses? I mean, that's a key question, and I hope to address that. What is a loss, and what kinds of losses are there? And then a key sentence that in the first paragraph here that I'm going to say more than once. All unresolved grief is stress, but not all stress is unresolved grief. That's critical. That's absolutely a critical idea that we need to keep in mind. In part 2 next week, we're going to look at the grief process. 4 things need to happen. Whether you lost, whether your closest friend died, or whether you lost your keys. And it's ironically, it's the same 4 things. It's the same 4 things. We'll be using a model from William Ward, his grief model, and we'll look at those 4 things. Then we're going to look at biblical examples of pain and grief. We're going to look at the many factors known to influence the grief process. We're going to look at a special table that comes out of Carolyn Woodward, a nurse and a grief researcher, in which you could actually predict the longevity and the intensity of the grief. If you know, it's a table, it's a quadrant. If you know 2 factors, was the grief preventable? What was the grief, I went into 2 factors. Was the grief preventable, and also the longevity of the grief? I'll explain that when we get to that part. Was the grief preventable, and was the person or thing central or peripheral in your life? These are the 2 variables. And if you know those 2, you can actually predict the longevity of the grief and the intensity of the grief. And then part 3, we're going to look at unresolved grief, which, and this is the good thing, that can be successfully managed. And I'm going to throw out some personal grief management suggestions. Also, the critical part of professional assistance if it is needed. And then the fun part that I close with is practical do's and don'ts. Things that you should say or not say to a grieving person. And turning it around, things that you as a griever are appropriate to hear and things that are just inappropriate for people to say to you. That's a critical piece. Are things that people say acceptable or unacceptable? Are they harmful or helpful? And when to challenge such a person that says something to you that's inappropriate for you as a griever. It's a very heavy subject, but I think it's a subject that we need to know a lot more about, which is where I'm going to begin my presentation. The good news is that most of us, most of the time, get through our losses. That's the good news. And the other part of the good news is that grief can be successfully managed. And that's why it's really helpful to know what grief is, what losses are, what things help us, what things hinder us. And so but then I want to throw out that idea that it's not all that bad. I mean, it's a heavy subject, but there are so many positive parts to this, especially as we learn more about it. So I carry around me in my mind, if you will, a chip on my shoulder, because this is the degree to which grief has been intentionally or unintentionally avoided by our society. It's a subject that everybody should know more about, but it's a subject that is very rarely ever talked about. If you can think of how many times in your everyday dealings that someone has talked to you about maybe the grief that they are experiencing, but not the whole idea of learning more about grief. So it will be one of my goals in this series to help us to appreciate the extent to which we are all grieving. And I hope to present a case. I hope to present a case that helps us to understand that there are these dramatic losses, the main one being death, but there are also substrata of losses, that some of which we don't even identify as losses, and in fact, some of which are actually positive experiences that have grief components. I welcome your observations. You please interrupt me for questions. I'll time permitting. I think we probably will have some time to do that. I want this to be a mutual experience in which we share with each other our ideas, our observations, probably based on some of your own losses and how you addressed those. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time with a question, with a comment. I want this to be a mutual experience. So a number of years ago, a Swiss psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the name probably rings a bell. She has interesting lady. She was the first to identify the idea of a process that people go through during a loss. Interesting lady because, first of all, it's Elizabeth with an S, not a Z. She's from Switzerland. She has degrees in psychiatry. She's an MD. She has degrees in theology. She has a law degree. She has really covered the bases. A really monumental and legendary person. So she developed this very crude model of grief model, which many other people have built upon ever since then. She goes back, I think, into the 60s. Grief remains in many ways a mysterious force in our lives. it comes into our subconscious in many different levels. And how we grieve affects how we live daily. Those two things are connected. So that in the words of the Reverend Anne Huey, the more we learn how to grieve, the more we learn how to live. First, a few definitions. I define grief as sorrow caused by loss, disaster, or misfortune. It has been said that grief is the price we pay for love. Grief is the price we pay for love. For the love of ourselves and for the love of others, so that in the words of John Bratner, only people who avoid love can avoid grief. Only people who avoid love can avoid grief. Not only that, there's a series among theologians and psychologists that our ability to love connects with our subconscious knowledge that we can only love that which we are going to lose. This is really heavy. This was just sharing a personal experience. This was a breakthrough aha moment in my spiritual journey when I learned of this idea, and when I happened upon it actually, that we can only truly love that which we're going to ultimately lose. This is like the most profound the most profound theological thing that I've ever discovered. Because in the back of my mind, there was always the question of, why are we mortal? What? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Why are we not immortal? Why did not God create us to be immortal? But instead, God created us to be mortal. Why? But I got this, I was able to actually sort this out through the writings of a couple of theologians. Henry Nouwen, the Dutch Catholic theologian, makes this case. He says, we are not made to love immortal things. Only what is irreplaceable, unique, and mortal can touch our deepest human sensitivities as a source of hope and consolation. God only became lovable. God only became lovable when God became mortal. I mean, that's huge. That's very profound. He became our Savior because of his mortality, which is not fatal, but the way to hope. So then Nouwen goes on to quote this very profound passage from My Name is Asher Lever. My name is Asher Lever. So to set this, it's from a novel. Asher Lev. It's from a novel by an American rabbi and scholar. My Name is Asher Lever discovered something of this. He longed to draw and paint as an artist from his youngest days. Patak is the author, by the way. And I drew too the way my father once looked at a bird lying on its side against the curb near our house. It was Shabbos, Sabbath, and we were on our way back from synagogue. Is the bird dead, Papa? I was 6, and I could not bring myself to look at it. Yes, I heard him say in a sad and distant way. Why did it die? Everything that lives must die. Everything? Yes. You too, Papa and Mama and me? Yes, he said. Then he added, but may it only be after you have lived a good and long life, my Asher. I could not grasp it. I forced myself to look at that bird. Everything alive would one day be as still as that bird? Why? I asked. So life would be precious, Asher. Here's the key line. Something that is precious, something that is yours forever, could never be precious. That's wow. And also Abraham Maslow, the psychiatrist, psychologist, has also picked up the same thing, same idea, quoting from Maslow. The confrontation with death and the reprieve from it makes everything look so precious, so sacred, so beautiful, that I feel more strongly than ever the impulse to love it, embrace it, and to let myself be overwhelmed by it. Death and its ever-present possibility makes love, passionate love, more possible. Maslow concludes, I wonder if we could love passionately at all, if we knew we would never die. That's like, wow, that's really profound theology. So now I want to move to my own grief and loss experiences, which begin with my own losses, but also include losses from that I addressed during my career as a hospital chaplain, which many of you know was my main career, hospital and clinic chaplain. I finished that career as a clinic chaplain in a cancer clinic. And as you can well guess, that both the hospital and the clinic chaplaincies involve ministering to dying patients. I had served in a hospital with an inpatient palliative care unit where the expected event is death. In one of the VAs that I was connected with that was connected with a national cemetery, I did as many as 2 to 3 funerals a day, but not, of course, not every day. So where I'm going with this, I was around death and dying a lot. And I think that I learned over the years, I learned a lot about the process, the losses and grief. One of the things that struck me in my daily routine as a chaplain is that separate from the hospice unit was that in my daily rounds on medical and surgical units, I would start conversations with patients and families. And I start to conclude that something else was going on here. Something else besides the medical issue that they were being hospitalized for. I started to think about, did these people really just become ill? And I reason that too often I just might be seeing the toll of unresolved grief. Here's a caveat, please, before I go any further. Please don't conclude from what I'm going to say next that all disease and all sickness, mental, physical, whatever, is related to unresolved grief. That would be a huge oversimplification. I'm simply saying that I believe that unresolved grief plays a critical role in some illnesses and diseases. In the average year in the United States, there are approximately 400,000 children and people under the age of 25 that die. About 30,000 suicides, 50,000 highway deaths. So that cumulatively, we are talking just in the section that I gave you, we're cumulatively talking about 8 million grievers per year. And this is just, but the point that we're trying to make is that as sobering as these statistics are, they don't even scratch the surface. because the key word here is not death. The key word is loss, and even possibly change or loss. The most obvious example is death, of course, but there are others of only slightly less severity. There's a whole second level of losses, of physical losses, becoming blind, becoming deaf, amputation. These are physical losses that are that bring with them, of course, that very severe grief. Also, there are a third level of losses, if you will, that include things like moving to another community, changing jobs or careers, the empty nest, the ending of a relationship, retirement, a miscarriage, or even the feelings of failure or inadequacy. These are all defined losses. Other losses are so subtle that we don't even think of them as losses. For example, some of the most positive life experiences actually have loss components, such as promotions, marriages, and graduations, and awards. I mean, these are all positive, wonderful life experiences, and yet they have subcomponents of losses. And then we come to the one that's perhaps the most subtle of all, but affects everybody in this room, and in fact, everybody on the planet. The aging process. The aging process. Every year you have a birthday. Every once in a while you look in the mirror or you feel something in your body that's a little older. And there's one part of your subconscious is saying to another part of your subconscious, you know what, you're not going to be around forever. And by the way people treat birthdays is very interesting. Some people are really out there and want the world to know, and other people are get depressed. I mean, that whole thing. But the aging process is clearly, not clearly, but perhaps one of the most universal examples of a very subtle loss. The change from day to day in our aging is minuscule, but of course, over a period of days and weeks and months, cumulative, you are talking about a lot of different things. Bertha Simos is a social worker. Here's what she says about losses. It is an error to distinguish between major and minor losses because in the subconscious, all losses merge. Losses, no one can say what constitutes a loss to another person. Losses can be real or imaginary. Losses can be real or imaginary, permanent or temporary. Where am I here? Losses can be real or imaginary, permanent or temporary, total or partial, sudden or gradual. Let me say that one more time. Losses can be real or imaginary, permanent or temporary, total or partial, sudden or gradual. Not only that, she suggests that in loss in its very broadest sense is change. The whole idea of change. She said that's a much broader way of looking at loss. Another thing that I wanted to point out about loss is that it is not just limited to humans. 8 species of primates have been shown to grieve. The example that I love to give is from Scotland in Edinburgh. There's a statue honoring a dog whose name was Greyfriars Bobby. I think Walt Disney actually made a movie out of this at some point, or at least it's in one of his movies. Greyfriars Bobby, his master, died on January 14th, 1872. That dog spent the final 14 years of its life, once a day, going over to the grave of his master and circling the grave and going back to his home. Greyfriars Bobby. Long before scientists could identify a grief process, however, this theme was central in the arts for centuries, in music, in drama, in literature, in art. Both the theme of loss and grief, as well as its toll, for example, that theme of the loss and grief, as well as the toll of it. Thomas Mann was a novelist who wrote a novel in 1924 called The Magic Mountain. Thomas Mann could not possibly have known the physiology of grief that renders grievers vulnerable to disease and sometimes even death. Yet in 1924, here's what he wrote about The Magic Mountain. The father, Herman Kastorf, could not grieve his loss. He had been deeply attached to his wife, and not being the strongest himself, never quite recovered from her death. His spirit was troubled. He shrank inside himself. His benumbed brain made him blunder in his business. And soon the firm of Kastorf and Son suffered sensible financial losses. The next spring, while inspecting warehouses on the Windy Landing stage, he got inflammation of the lungs. The fever was too much for his shaken heart, and in 5 days, he died. Here's a case of unresolved grief taking its toll in the most extreme form, and that which is death. Unresolved grief always becomes, it's what it's called dying of a broken heart. You've probably heard that expression many times. So unresolved grief always becomes stress, but not all stress is unresolved grief. I'm going to say that a thousand times. Stress, often in the form of unresolved grief, will usually take its toll in one of three ways: physical illness or injury, emotional illness or personality disorders, or simply interference with one's everyday activities. Let's take these one at a time. Physical illnesses or injuries. We now know the actual physiology of why people who are grieving and why grief, unresolved grief, and how unresolved grief, I should say, affects them physically. It turns out that lymphocytes and T cells in your blood are, when you are grieving, study after study shows that your body starts to drop lymphocytes and T cells, which are your line of defense against infections and other kinds of diseases. In one study, virtually all of the blood samples taken from widowers were dramatically low in terms of their value, because the widowers are grieving. Sociologist Ken Smith found that suddenly widowed men are 52% more likely to die themselves within 6 months of their wife's death than men of similar age whose wives are alive. 52%. within 6 months. The surviving spouse is gone. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. In not quite an extreme toll, unresolved grief can turn into physical illness or injury. This gets back to my days as a chaplain. They did a study at the University of Michigan Medical Center. They did just randomly selected units, hospital units, randomly selected patients, and found that 81% of those patients had had a significant loss in their lives within the previous year. In a Detroit hospital, that figure was 91%. So I'm making a case here for unresolved grief. It is in one of its most extreme forms in taking its toll in physical illness or injury. My overall goal is this, to try to look at how unresolved grief operates within our bodies, within our society, within our lives. In this connection, it gets more fascinating, these studies. It's mind-boggling. A researcher whose name is Arthur Schmale used a psychological test checking for recent emotional losses on a large group of women, some of whom had cervical cancer, already diagnosed, but unknown to the researcher. Of the 51 women who had malignancies, the researcher was able to identify 36 of them, that's 70%. In a Minnesota study, women receiving Pap tests were first given a 20-minute interview with a social worker. This time, the social worker could predict with an accuracy exceeding 85% which of the Pap tests would come back, 95%, which of the Pap tests would come back positive or negative. It's almost like, you know, a cynical person could almost say, why do we need Pap tests? We could just sit down with a social worker and then after that, sit down with a physician. Now we get to sports. I love this. This is the next part that I really love. A similar model was applied to 100 randomly selected college football players. This time, the social worker could predict with an accuracy exceeding 85% which of those players were going to become injured in the coming year. I'm always amused when sports teams tell you that they had bad luck by their injuries. If you can predict something with 85% accuracy, what does it have to do with luck? I mean, what am I missing here? We are so preoccupied with the biomedical model that we don't understand how it's connected to the psychosocial. If I were a coach or a general manager of a sports team, I would go out and hire social workers before I would hire trainers or assistant coaches or whatever. The teams are slowly getting it. I mean, they're very, very gradual. And even though it's been a long process, they're slowly getting it. As an example, in 2019, the NBA mandated to every team in the NBA that they had to have on their staff either a clinical social worker, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. So the teams are gradually getting it. But to just say, you know, gosh, we had bad luck. No, you didn't. Not if you could predict it with 85% accuracy. Which brings us to the life change scale, the Holmes-Rahe scale. I'm going to ask Beverly to pass out these. It gets more interesting.
Excuse me, Pastor Weeden.
Yes,
Hi, it's Darlene. I have a question for you in regards to the study that you said with widows dying within 6 months of
Yeah.
their husband or that. Was
Yeah.
that done like in an age group? You know, more like people in their 80s or their 70s or their 60s?
That's a very valid question, and I wish I could, my honest answer is I don't know.
Okay, I was just curious if if they had broken it down by age.
That's a really good question. And I can give you the name of the researcher, but maybe you could look that up
Okay,
if I can find it.
well, that's fine. I can get it later from Pastor.
Okay, by the way, this is being recorded, and one of the reasons I asked Dennis to record it was because Pastor Ari, who desperately wanted to be here and will be here in the next 2 weeks, he had the confirmation class today, and he felt really bad about that. So he said, so I asked Dennis if he could please record it, and I'm very glad we're on Zoom because I think the fact that we're on Zoom makes it easy to record. Is that right, Dennis? Thank you. Thank you, Dennis, for all of your help. So I'm looking at this, the life change unit rating scale. I don't know if I can show this. Anyway, this is a scale which will be available eventually for you to see. But for those of you who are here, I think it flips over to the other side. Is that correct? Okay, so you can see that Holmes and Ray Hay were researchers out of the University of Nevada. This has been available they started it in the 1970s. There's also one for children, by the way, that they did for children, which is fascinating. So anyway, they tried to look at life change units and how those life change units affect our ability to function and our vulnerability to disease, physically and mental disease. And it begins with the death of a spouse, value of 100, and it goes all the way down to, I guess it's minor violations of the law. The thing that I want to point out about this is that the life change units are listed in order of severity. Notice that 7 of the first 10 are clearly losses. 3 are not, yet have loss components. This is what I talked about earlier. There can be positive events, graduations, awards, promotions, which in and of themselves are very wonderful things that happen in our lives. But they also have, and many of them have loss components. But anyway, okay. But here's the point that I wanted to make I think you have to flip this. So if you took this little test and your number of units were 100 to 199, you're in a life crisis. The period of probability of severe illness within 2 years is 37%. When I say severe illness, I mean mental, physical, personality disorders, or any kind of serious life issue. 200 to 299 is a moderate life crisis, 51%. 300 or more, a severe life crisis, 79%. Any comments on this? Most people that have shown it Most people that I've shown it to, they they sort of go down the list and they think,
Richard,
yes,
but, okay, wouldn't some of these things be different? Have a different impact on different people?
correct.
Okay,
Where are you going with that?
well, it's like, I don't know, I was looking at, one of the things that's pretty low down on the first page is a change in residence.
Okay,
And that it, is, can be a positive thing. You can move and be in a new neighborhood or situation that you find to be more positive.
but you're
Or-
leaving, okay, but a good example, but I'm gonna play the devil's advocate.
What?
I'm gonna play the devil's advocate. You're
Oh, yes.
leaving.
He always plays the devil. I don't understand it sometimes.
Okay, but you're,
This is a common phrase in our marriage. I would play the devil's advocate.
okay, but you're going to this your new residence, okay? It's a beautiful place. You maybe it's your dream house or your dream apartment. But you're leaving behind a place that you had, a place that has many, many memories, maybe some good, some bad.
Yeah.
And you're leaving behind this residence that you knew that was home for you. And that alone, to me, would be a lost component.
I've got a question.
Please.
I guess I don't understand what I see as positive life changes, how the grieving comes in, like we say, promotion or marriage or other change in work. How does the grieving,
Wonderful question. And I'm going to address that right away.
okay,
In a marriage, in a marriage, the couple is leaving their parents. I mean, this takes many different forms. It's very different in today's world than it was, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago. But the same idea is still there. You are leaving, in many cases, you're leaving your home. You are leaving your primary relationships, which were with your parents. In a promotion, let's say you get a promotion at work. You are changing the relationship with your colleagues so that instead of being one of them, you're being you're their boss and they're subordinate to you. I mean, that's a whole, that's a whole.
friendship?
Those are just two examples that come to mind.
Well, then I guess what I'm having trouble separating is I can see these positive examples that I'm referring to involving stress. How does stress differ from grief?
How does stress get?
Differ from grief.
Okay, I'm gonna say not all stress is grief, but all grief, all unresolved grief is stress.
Okay.
I mean, it sounds simplistic theoretically, but in reality, it's a little bit more difficult to. It's easier. So let me say this: it's easier said than done.
Well, if I could say something, like say you get a promotion, you may have liked doing the job that you were doing, and you're gonna lose those responsibilities. That would be a form of grief.
Okay.
Because you're gonna lose those things you were doing, and you're doing something different. So it's positive that way, but, you may believe that the loss of the responsibility that you have.
Graduation. You are suddenly going out into the world. You have graduated. You have done your academic work successfully. So wonderful. Your friends, your family, everybody's proud of you. time for celebration, but you are leaving these people that you were with, in some cases 4 years, in some cases more years, who became not, maybe not family, although in some cases they do become almost like family. And that alone is a loss, grief experience. Okay, so that's the physical toll of unresolved grief. I want to talk about a second way in which grief will take its toll if it's unresolved by emotional illnesses, personality disorders, or in some mental health issue. A study that tracked numerous patients admitted for acute psychiatric care, as well as patients under treatment at mental health clinics, 40% of the primary diagnoses strongly suggested a component of unresolved grief. Professor R.W. Ramsey of the University of Amsterdam makes a very convincing case for a strong correlation between unresolved grief and phobias. I have my phobias. I don't know about you, but I don't normally think about. And when I'm thinking about a phobia that I have, I don't normally think, oh, must have some unresolved grief. And again, I'm not suggesting that all phobias are unresolved grief. The sports world. I'm back to the sports world, okay? A number of years ago, a Major League Baseball player was leading the American League in batting in May of that year. By July, he had slumped to third from the bottom of the American League, going from leading the league in May to July, third from the bottom. In the ensuing time, the player had experienced the death of his mother, his sister, and a close friend. From college football. In a Big Ten college football game, a quarterback set a record for the most interceptions ever thrown in a college football game. Kind of bad. The night before that game, his mother telephoned him to tell him that his closest boyhood and adolescent friend had died. A little closer to home, Olympic medalist Dan Jansen, who both Greenfield and West Allis, they both claim him, interestingly enough. During the tryouts for the 1988 Winter Olympics, Dan was notified of his sister's death. And the next day, Dan actually fell during the tryouts. And 3 days later, he fell again. He eventually did win the gold in the 100 meter in 1994. Okay, so what are the common signs of unresolved grief? What are some of the common signs? A researcher by the name of Balfour Mont, he's a Canadian surgeon. I actually heard him at a conference once. I actually met Balfour Mont. After his mother died, he modified his career to start, in addition to being a surgeon, he modified his career based on his mom's death into grief research. And he has written a lot of very, very poignant research on grief. He suggests that the signs of unresolved grief consists of the following. One, physical ones, gastrointestinal problems, frequent headaches, sleep disturbances, muscular twitching. Two, psychological signs, depression, anger, blunting of affect, liability of moods. Three, attitudes, feelings of omnipotence, negativism, closed thinking. Four, relationships, discord in family and personal relationships, in particular, distancing oneself from others. 5, one's work, increased absenteeism or workaholic. That's interesting. It could increase absenteeism or workaholic. More time with paperwork or computer, anger at supervisors, questioning the ability of coworkers. This is just fascinating. And finally, habits, overeating or undereating, abandonment of recreational activities. We used to go to the park on Friday nights, but we don't do that anymore. Why? The list could go on and on. Increased use of tobacco, alcohol, or drugs, and finally, vulnerability to accidents. I once had a colleague who totaled her car twice in 1 month. Twice. Was it a coincidence? Possibly, but I knew of a number of serious grief issues in her personal life. So that's where I end. I've got one eye on that clock. I wasn't sure. I've done this in 2 parts. I've done it in 4 parts. I wasn't sure. I actually think on one occasion I did it in 1 part, which was kind of insane. But I wasn't sure how it was my time limit. I wasn't sure how this would work out. I did want to allow some times for any questions, but you have also helped me in that regard by you took me at my word to interrupt me. And thank you also those who are on Zoom. Thank you for interrupting me, because I want you to interrupt me and ask questions and not wait until the end. And there might or might not be time, and you might or might not forget. I might or might not have forgotten where in the lecture that was. I'd like to close with the other thing that I've done is I compiled a series of just for stuff for my files on grief and loss. And one of the these are not directly related in terms of content to what I talked about, or some of them are indirectly related. One struck me that I thought I might use for today because it's autumn, and this one has to do with autumn. Joyce Rupp, I don't know if you've heard of Joyce Rupp. She's a non Sisters of Notre Dame. She is one of the most prolific writers in. I recommend anything that she has written. She's awesome. She wrote a book called Praying Our Goodbyes. No, it's an excerpt from Praying Our Goodbyes, and it's from when a loved one has died. But I found it a kind of interesting because she does reference autumn. It is autumn, of course, as we know. There is an ache in autumn that is also within each one of us. This ache is the deep stillness of a late September morning when mist covers the land and the sound of geese going south fills the sky. There's a wordless yearning or a longing for something in the air, and it penetrates the human spirit. It is a tender, nostalgic desire to gather our treasures and hold them close, because the ache tells us that someday those treasures will need to be left behind. Autumn speaks to this pain in our own spirits, that ache which we try so hard to ignore or deny or push aside. That little persistent reminder that death is always a part of life. The ache of autumn is that in us has 2 faces. One is an ache that lies deep down inside of our being. The other is the ache that results from our own individual particular losses. those farewells that are always going on in our lives. Take time to remember the special qualities which you loved so much and appreciated in your loved one's personality and life. Remember the special events in your lives that were full of joy and happiness, and offer thanks to God for all these blessings. Pour out your feelings of sadness and sorrow to God and ask God to enter into the deep pain that permeates your life. And that reminds me of a James Taylor song, which is kind of the same idea. Shower the people you love with love. Tell them how much that you, tell them the way that you feel. It's the same idea that Joyce Rupp has just told us about. And that I don't do that enough. I wish I did it more, but I think we all do it because you never know. I mean, life is so fragile, and aging has a little bit to do with it. But you know, within the last couple months, Beverly and I have lost a close pastor friend in Michigan. We lost our next door neighbor. Then there was one other loss that I'm trying to think of. I mean, life is just so fragile that we never know what the next day will bring. And that's why I think it's always important to tell people, our friends, our family, how much we love them and thank you for who they are and for being part of our lives.